In part one of my two-part series on famous American writer Henry David Thoreau, I attempted to provide an overview of Thoreau's life and ideas. In this program, part two, what I would like to do is to emphasize Thoreau's value to us. But first, a brief review of some of the points I made in part one. I pointed out that in 1845, Thoreau went to live in the woods in an area outside of Concord, Massachusetts, to conduct an experiment in living, and that today people in virtually every area of the world are familiar with this experiment because he wrote a classic book about it, a book entitled Walden. And I pointed out that the reason the book is called Walden is that Thoreau built a one-room cabin next to a pond called Walden in the area of Concord, Massachusetts. And again, he did this in 1845. He spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living in the woods, conducting again what he called an experiment in living. I pointed out that Professor Joseph Wood Crutch, a Thoreau scholar who taught at Columbia University, said that if one were to summarize Thoreau's philosophy, it could be done in one word, and that word is simplify. Thoreau believed that in order for him to live a fulfilling life, and perhaps for us as well, one should simplify one's needs and ambitions. One should be able to take delight in the simple pleasures of life, most notably the pleasures which the world of nature affords, and also that simplifying one's life means scorning public opinion. Thoreau believed that so many people jeopardize their opportunities for happiness in this life by paying too much attention to what other people think of them. In Walden, Thoreau asks us to think about what might be the highest of arts. Is painting, sculpting, teaching, practicing medicine, is any one of those the highest of arts? Thoreau says no. And again, here is his take on this subject. He says this, and I'm quoting him: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts." Thoreau had 2 books published in his lifetime. Prior to Walden being published, several years before, he had a book entitled A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers published. Actually, he self-published it. He could not get any publisher to assume the cost of producing the book, so he produced the book. But it was not a very successful commercial venture. Indeed, Thoreau lost quite a bit of money on it. And in 1853, in his journal, and Thoreau was an inveterate journal keeper, he recorded this. He said that today, more than 700 unsold copies of my book have been returned to me, so that I now have a library of approximately 900 books, over 700 of which I wrote myself. In 1849, 2 years after Thoreau left the woods, he was accused in a letter to the editor of the New York Herald of being indifferent to humanity and to the suffering of humanity. In fact, let me give you some precise information about this. A letter to Horace Greeley's New York Tribune criticized Thoreau, and the letter writer spoke of his wife's attitude towards Thoreau. And now I'm quoting from the letter. She declares that nobody has a right to live for himself alone, away from the interests, the affections, and the sufferings of his kind. Quite an accusation. Thoreau, this very famous writer, at least today, he is a very famous writer. He wasn't back then. But indeed, he was reasonably well known back then. People had read in some of the New York newspapers about his experiment in living. And also, he had some articles published. In any event, Here is a woman accusing Thoreau, this famous American writer and loner, of being indifferent to the sufferings of humanity. And the question is, was this true? No, it wasn't. And let me provide some evidence. Perhaps the best evidence that I can present concerns the fact that Henry David Thoreau was a very active participant in the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts. You might recall the Underground Railroad was a system of helping slaves to escape from the southern part of the United States to Canada. Thoreau sometimes hid slaves out at his cabin at Walden Pond. Other times he hid the slaves at his mother's house in the village of Concord. Professor Walter Harding has written what many consider to be the definitive biography of Thoreau. It's entitled The Days of Henry Thoreau. And in this biography, Professor Harding quotes Mrs. Edwin Bigelow, who was the lead conductor, in a certain sense, of the Underground Railroad in Thoreau's part of the country. And Harding sets up the passage this way. He points out that she said that rarely a week went by in Concord, Massachusetts, without some fugitive slave being harbored overnight in town and sped along his way before daylight. Mrs. Bigelow stated that, and I'm quoting now, quoting Mrs. Bigelow, Henry Thoreau, more than any other man in Concord, looked after them for the night, purchasing their tickets, escorting them to the train station, and for further protection, accompanying them on the trains for a while, although taking care to sit in separate seats so as not to attract attention. If I were to submit additional evidence to try to prove that Thoreau was not indifferent to the sufferings of humanity, I would point out, and will point out, that in 1846, as a matter of principle, Thoreau went to jail, and he went to jail because he had refused to pay a particular tax. And he said that the reason he refused to pay this tax is that the federal government was allowing almost 4 million people to live in slavery in America. And he said that he would not pay a tax to support a government that condoned slavery. Thoreau only spent one night in jail. And the reason he spent only a night in jail is that someone, we don't know who, paid his back taxes, and the following morning Thoreau was released. And some biographers claim that the jailers had to force Thoreau to leave because, as a matter of principle, he wanted to remain in jail to protest this tax and slavery. What is really so important about this development is that Thoreau wrote a very famous essay entitled Civil Disobedience, in which he claimed that at times it can be moral to break laws. Indeed, it is a moral action to break an immoral law. And that's how he justified his not paying his tax to the federal government, or to paying a tax which would have ended up in the hands of the federal government. In the 20th century, both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. were both very much influenced by civil disobedience. In this essay, almost certainly the most famous essay on this topic, Thoreau says that there is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men. It is also interesting that Ralph Waldo Emerson, the very famous writer who also lived in Concord, Massachusetts, urged the people of Massachusetts not to obey the fugitive slave law. The Fugitive Slave Law was a law passed by the federal government in 1850, which required people anywhere in the country to help in returning escaped slaves. And Emerson, like Thoreau, contended that obeying that law to return escaped slaves would be an immoral action, and that disobeying the law would be a moral action. I think I would be remiss in talking about Henry David Thoreau if I didn't spend some time talking about his Staten Island sojourn. At age 25, 2 years before going to live in the woods, Thoreau visited Staten Island and indeed stayed here for approximately 6 months. The reason he came here was to earn some money. Ralph Waldo Emerson's brother, William Emerson, was a judge on Staten Island, and he had 3 children, and he hired Thoreau to be their tutor. Emerson arrived on Staten Island in May 1843, and he took up residence in Judge Emerson's home on what is now called Emerson Hill. The house was on Douglas Road near Richmond Road, and the house afforded Thoreau a wonderful view of the ocean. And Thoreau, in his journal, reports that he often took walks on the beaches of Staten Island, and at other times, from the vantage point of the house, watched the procession of ships go up and down the Narrows. And of course, he often wandered the countryside on Staten Island and was much impressed with some of the Huguenot farms. Professor Harding, whom I mentioned before, has written what some consider to be the definitive biography on Thoreau, says that what most impressed Thoreau was the ocean, that he had never had the opportunity to live near an ocean for an extended time, and never would again in his life have such an opportunity. Thoreau also tells us in his journal that he visited Manhattan between 20 and 30 times. Yes, even in those days there was a ferry to Manhattan. And he says that he walked from the Battery to Washington Square. He also points out that much of northern Manhattan was still woods. Much of northern Manhattan at this time, in the 1840s, was still undeveloped. Among the advantages that the city afforded Thoreau were access to bookstores and libraries. In some ways, the highlight of his trip to Staten Island was visiting libraries and bookstores in Manhattan. But on balance, Thoreau indicates that he didn't like Staten Island. The other advantage that he derived from visiting Staten Island and New York is that he met Horace Greeley, who was the editor of a famous newspaper in New York called the Tribune, the New York Tribune. And Greeley volunteered to be Thoreau's literary agent. And years later, Thoreau did profit from this. Professor Harding provides a summary view of Thoreau's Staten Island experience, and this is what he says, and I'm quoting him. Unfortunately, Thoreau was never really happy on Staten Island or in New York City. In the first place, he was in poor health. There seems to be every indication that his tuberculosis had flared up the previous winter. This tuberculosis, by the way, would eventually kill him at age 44. To make matters worse, he found himself almost intolerably homesick for both his family and Concord. And Harding concludes with this statement: the Staten Island experiment, on the whole, had to be written off as a failure. What I would like to do now is to provide a summary view of what might be Thoreau's value to us. Thoreau died in 1862, approximately a year after the Civil War began. So he's been dead almost 150 years. And the question is he still of value to us? And I think I can prove that yes, he is still of great value to us. First, I think Thoreau wakes us up. You will recall that I pointed out in part 1 that on the original title page of Walden, Thoreau said that one of his purposes in writing the book was to awaken his neighbors. And indeed, I think he probably awakened them, and I think he also wakes us up. How so? Well, I think he wakes us up about different dimensions of the human experience. He talks about loneliness, and he points out that he was rarely lonely, and that we can often be more lonely with others than when alone. He talks about solitude and the joys of solitude. He talks about the fact that, in his opinion, that it's lamentable that many people avoid being alone, since it can be a joyful experience. Thoreau also talks about our daily social intercourse, and he says that so much of it involves mask wearing. He indicates that when we get together with other people, very often, in his words, it's surface meeting surface. And in this context, he talked about friendship. You recall, I pointed out last week that Thoreau said all people dream about friendship. But he claimed that most people's friendships are very superficial, and that the kind of friendship he aimed at was the kind of friendship that Aristotle wrote about in some of his works. Aristotle said that in the highest friendship, one soul contacts another soul, and that in such a friendship, what each person gives each other, or I should say what each person gives the other, is stimulus, encouragement, and example in the art of living well and living virtuously. Thoreau also teaches us to be self-reliant. He suggests that we look inward for joy. He says that the mistake so many people make, as he saw it, was that too many people look to the external world for joy. And he believed that enjoying solitude was a form of self-reliance. And he believed that thinking can be exciting, which reminds me of something Professor Joseph Campbell pointed out. Campbell, as you might recall, was a professor of mythology at Sarah Lawrence College. And Professor Campbell said that as we grow older, it might be a good idea for us to think of ourselves as being like light bulbs, in the sense that while the bulb may be cracking, the light, nevertheless, might be brighter than it's ever been. In other words, Campbell is saying that as we grow older, yes, our bodies will almost certainly deteriorate, but the mind can grow richer. Our consciousness can grow richer. And again, a reminder of what Thoreau so often pointed out, the idea that thinking can be exciting. And of course, I have pointed out in previous programs that the Buddha said that we are what we think. With our thoughts, we make the world. When Thoreau was dying, since he was a bachelor, his sister Sophia took care of him, and he was very sick for several months. And she told this story, that one day a friend came to visit Thoreau and wanted to know how he was before entering the bedroom. And Sophia's response was this. She said about her brother, and I'm quoting her, "His thoughts had entertained him all his life, and did still." Thoreau reminds us of the value of sincerity. You recall I pointed out in part one that Thoreau lamented the lack of sincerity among so many people, the rareness of sincerity in the world. And indeed he said this, and I'm quoting him, "Man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity." Which raises the question, does sincerity make a person more valuable to other people? Emerson, commenting on Thoreau's sincerity, said this, and I'm quoting Emerson, "Thoreau was sincerity itself." Thoreau also urges us to be virtuous, and warns us that there is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men. Thoreau believed that if we follow the masses, if we behave the way the majority of people behave, that we will compromise our morals. You will recall that Thoreau was a transcendentalist. Most of the transcendentalists believed that people were born good, but that society corrupted them. And again, the example they often gave was that no child had been born who believed that slavery was moral, but that children were taught that slavery was moral, and therefore society, which had taught them that slavery was moral, had corrupted them. It seems to me that Thoreau is Buddhist-like, and by the way, he was very interested in Buddhism. Thoreau believed that solitude is very important, but like the Buddhists, he also believed that service to his fellow human beings was likewise important. And Thoreau reminds us to cultivate our uniqueness. In one of the most famous passages from Walden, Thoreau says this, and again I'm quoting him: "If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away." Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, talked about the process of individuation and how important it is. Jung claimed that if one was to reach maximum mental health, it was very important for one to cultivate what was individual, what was idiosyncratic in oneself. Here is a statement from Jung, and again I'm quoting him: "Personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being." Allow me to say it again. Personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. Jung, like Thoreau, believed that conformity has a price. Yes, he admitted individuality also has a price. But Jung, psychiatrist Jung, like Thoreau, believed that the price people pay for conformity is much greater in the long run than they pay for individuality. Thoreau's an idealist, but he's also a realist. In his journal, he said this, and this might surprise you: "Life is a warfare, a struggle, and the diseases of the body answer to the troubles and defeats of the spirit." Again, life is a warfare, a struggle. Thoreau had been very much impressed by reading the Stoics, philosophers of antiquity, and some of the Stoics, in comparing life to a battle, said that if we are going to live fulfilling lives, we must think of ourselves as warriors. And Thoreau, at least in his works, implies that he, in that sense, considered himself to be a warrior. But even though life is difficult, even though Thoreau, like the Stoics, believed that life is difficult, he believed, like they also believed, that there is some compensation even in disappointments. Thoreau said this: "If we will be quiet and ready enough, we shall find a compensation in every disappointment." We shall find a compensation in every disappointment. Perhaps the most inspiring words I ever heard on this topic come from Joseph Campbell, the professor I alluded to before. Campbell said this: "Find a place of joy, and the joy will burn out the pain." Thoreau, of course, also believed that we should seek refreshment and inspiration in nature. And I spent much time last week talking about that. Finally, Thoreau encourages us to experiment. Walden was an experiment in living. Thoreau suggests that we experiment in not being status conscious. He suggests that we experiment in learning to enjoy our own company. He suggests that we seek happiness in non-materialistic ways. For example, in closer observation of the beauty around us. Observe the adorable faces of toddlers and children, pretty flowers and trees, cute dogs and cats, and of course just sitting in one's home near a window when the sun is pouring through the window. That can be a beautiful experience. He encourages us to formulate plans to make other people happy. He tells us to appreciate the beauty of the decent people around us. And he also encourages us to experience happiness in memories, specifically memories of some of the very good, noble things we have done in life. And of course, some of the other non-materialistic ways in which we can experience joy is through music. Nietzsche indeed said that life without music would be a mistake. And we can experience happiness through physical exercise and through meditation. And the meditation doesn't have to be any formal or organized meditation. That one of the things I do each day to get my day started on the right track is that I look at some quotations I've written down on 3x5 index cards, quotations from Shakespeare, Goethe, Thoreau, Emerson, ideas I want to remember. And I find that consulting these quotations each morning, and generally I change the cards I examine every month, I find these thoughts can get my day off to a better start. I think it is so unfortunate that we have been conditioned to look to things for happiness, in contrast to looking to experiences for happiness, because that's what Thoreau was really into, looking to experiences to make his life better. Finally, Thoreau reminds us that the greatest of arts is to affect the quality of the day.